a national movement pushing for equality and justice.
But the issues of racism in America span beyond policing. It's about systems and inequities that have been in place for years.
It's about housing, access to health care, education, and so much more.
KVUE's diving deep into Austin's racist roots, looking at the systems that stifle opportunities for blacks.
Because all lives can't matter until black lives do. This is a KVUE News special production, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Quita Culpepper.
And I'm Brian Mays. The issue of racism isn't an easy topic for anyone to confront, but it is necessary.
We know we can't address all issues related to racial inequality, but tonight our goal is to educate you about the barriers standing between black Austinites and the unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The obstacles to justice and equality often seem designed to hold people back. That's not new. Here's Ashley Godot.
Imagine race relations as a pendulum, momentum on one side growing, and then
something happens, or a piece is written, or a speech is given, or something is seen, and folks are shocked into a new consciousness, and the pendulum starts to go in the other direction.
Kevin Foster is a professor of Black Studies at the University of Texas and the executive producer of Blackademics Television. He says American history is filled with swings. In 1851, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin swings sentiment among Northerners on slavery.
She writes this humanizing book that in serial form that people are like going to the paper trying to get the next chapter, and it's sort of painting a picture that humanizes those who are enslaved, points out the moral quandaries, the problems with it, etc. And Northern readers are pulled off the fence.
In the 1950s and 60s, the nightly news brings the civil rights movement into people's living rooms.
And a lot of people that just don't want to be involved all of a sudden see these horrific images of fire hoses on people, you know, these marchers dressed really nicely just getting abused, dogs attacking. And again, people go, oh, okay, that's enough. We need to do something about this.
In 2020, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a Minneapolis police officer kneeled on the neck of George Floyd. He died. The video and reaction took over social media feeds, television, city streets, and this pendulum swing feels different.
We have a capacity to turn the narratives towards supporting our predisposed position. Right, so anytime there's any ambiguity, oh, but they were probably doing this, it's clear that something could be done differently. And so I think folks watching, they got it in a new way.
Whether it's a long-awaited and overdue recognition of the struggle or an awakening and realization that black lives haven't mattered as much as others in this country, there is now momentum in the movement, fueling calls for change. But in order to make that change, you have to understand the factors creating the problem.
There is the history, there are the biases, and there are the ongoing systemic realities.
A trio that appears in nearly every part of life for black Americans. The most obvious is policing.
For some, it might take them out of their comfort zone to truly understand that for many of us who have police officers in our family, by the way, and who know different police officers, that doesn't change the fact that for many of us, our experience of police when we encounter them is one of fear. And James Baldwin says, look, a cop is a cop, and she might be a very nice person, but I don't have time to figure all that out. What I see are guns and uniforms, and I know this might go wrong for me, no matter, so I'm just gonna go in the other direction. That is very, very hard for people to get with if all that's ever happened for them is that law officers have served them and served them well.
The racial inequalities span beyond the criminal justice system, from housing and healthcare to Austin's racist past with education.
Brown versus Board of Education came and went, and Austin was like, yeah, no thank you. And then finally the federal government said, folks, you kind of got to do this. And they said, okay, we'll do it. We'll do it. Watch us. And they closed down all the black institutions and started busing black kids all over the place and made a mess. And the way we did integration was classic maneuver where we did integration in a way to protect white interests at all costs and then do what we can for black folk after that.
The conversations may be difficult, self-reflection uncomfortable, but for those living with these realities every day, it's time for the pendulum to swing.
Dismantling our structures and rebuilding, or if you want to say reforming our structures so that they are more just, really takes thoughtful, comprehensive, and dare I even say brave work.
For the next 2 nights, we'll talk about the work to build a better Austin.
Still to come, protecting and
trucks, SUVs.
Welcome back to a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
We've brought you out to Austin Police Headquarters downtown. Racism tied to policing is an issue you just can't avoid if you're watching the news, on Facebook, scrolling through your Twitter feeds, sometimes even watching your favorite sports team. And after multiple recent displays of violence against Black Americans at the hands of police, the departments in the U.S. are being forced to change the way they do business. Austin's plans for police reform are some of the most radical in the country. The City Council approved $21 million worth of immediate cuts as part of APD's budget next year, and more massive cuts could be made later. Despite efforts to address it, the reality is racism, it hasn't disappeared. You can see it on the streets, in stores, and sometimes in interactions between law enforcement and the citizens they've sworn to serve and protect. In 1913, John Gaines was the first and only Black police officer in Austin. He was shot and killed at 6th and Trinity by a drunk deputy constable while waiting for backup. He wasn't allowed to arrest a white suspect. Now, more than 100 years later, There are 135 African Americans on the force,
I've always wanted to help people,
including Lieutenant Gizette Gaslin. From the time she was young, Gaslin dreamed of being part of something that would protect and serve her community. But becoming an Austin police officer wasn't her first choice. Her father is the one who encouraged her to apply.
I joined when I was 24 years old, and it's been the best decision of my life.
During her time at APD, Lieutenant Gaslin has been a recruiting sergeant and academy instructor.
I've been on the force now for 25 years, and so I've seen Austin grow. I've seen it change. I'm about to promote to commander here in the next 6 months, and I'll be the second African-American woman commander in the history of APD.
The lieutenant is part of the changing face of the department. But when it comes to racial issues, lately, APD has faced its fair share of controversy. The death of Michael Ramos, shot and killed by an Austin officer. Ramos, a black and Latino man, was unarmed. Numerous people, including college student Justin Howell, injured, hit by so-called less lethal rounds during protests over police brutality. How the department handled complaints against former Assistant Chief Justin Newsom. He left APD with full benefits after an investigation into his use of racist language against blacks. And in January, the city released a report that concluded, quote, people of color are still stopped in their motor vehicles at disproportionately higher rates than their percentage of the population here in Austin.
We've come a long way. We're a very progressive department, but do we have issues? Yes, we do.
In May, the killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis officers set off waves of protests and violence across the nation. In Austin, furious crowds faced off with APD and other law enforcement agencies, some hurling abuse, others begging for a dialogue, still others calling blacks in uniform traitors, telling them being black isn't a choice, but being proud of your badge and the power you hold over others is.
Where are you for us now? Where do you stand? Or are we threats to you as your people? Are we threats to you? Or can you not look at me?
Being black and being an officer is just tough in this day and age.
APD Corporal Michael Rohn knows all too well. The 17-year APD veteran says he's faced racism in and out of uniform and asks other officers to speak out if they see racism within the ranks.
One thing, if you let that go, then it festers and it will continue on. But the way I approach it, if it happens, is we're going to deal with this right here and now. And it might be an investigation, it might not, but you're going to either report it to your supervisor. You have to take some action, and I think that's the only way you weed out racist officers.
APD's motto is One Austin, safer together. Minorities continue to make up a relatively small part of the force.
I've had many people stop me and say, you know what, you're the first black officer I've seen in Austin. And I'm like, wow, really? And then you start thinking about that and you're like, well, do we need more officers? Yes, in my opinion, I think we do.
But experts say people of color, especially African American males, are less likely to apply for the force when so many are taught to avoid officers and believe they're disproportionately targeted by police. Lieutenant Gaslin says before you can see a change in APD on the outside, you have to fix the problems inside.
It doesn't change that I'm a black woman in this society. When I take this uniform off, people sometimes I still get followed in stores, or people say, hey, they don't say, hey, can I help you? So I still have that experience as a black woman, but I can share those experiences with the officers that I work with. You want us in police work. You want us to be able to represent and be able to educate the other officers, because you don't want an all-white department.
Corporal Rohn says building a bridge of trust between APD and the community will take time and means more community policing, adding minorities to the ranks, additional training about race relations, perhaps a de-escalation unit, and
weeding out racist officers immediately. We have a no tolerance if you lie. If that happens, then I think it will get better within the department, and I think the community can see that.
Ahead, racist roots, a look at inequities that have existed in Austin for decades. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
Welcome back to a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
This is the George Washington Carver Museum in East Austin. This museum aims to preserve black culture, history, and expression. And while many consider Austin a hotbed for advocacy and social change, its racist roots run deep. Here's KVUE's Bob Buckaloo.
The Civil War was over. Eventually, 3.5 million enslaved black Americans would be free. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation that ended slavery in the Confederacy was issued several years before, it wasn't until June 19, 1865, Juneteenth, that word reached Texas when Union General Gordon Granger announced the order to the people of Galveston. As the news spread across Texas, 250,000 enslaved people suddenly faced the reality of having to figure out how to make a home, put food on the table, and create a better future for their families. But in the period after the Civil War, matters could not have been more difficult. Confederate states like Texas were determined that ex-slaves would neither be truly free nor equal. Jim Crow and black codes were the frameworks for a strict system of racial segregation and white supremacy. By 1870, blacks made up 30% of Texas' total population, but there had been so much violence against them, many would travel to bigger cities where federal troops could offer protection, and for some, that meant a trek to Austin. Many blacks in Central Texas would settle in what were known as freedmen's communities. At one time, Austin had 15 separate enclaves where black Americans lived close together, establishing their own businesses, schools, and churches. There was Clarksville, established by Charles Clark in 1871, home to hundreds of freed slaves. Today, located just west of Mopac between West 6th and 10th Streets, the Clarksville neighborhood is known as a place for expensive homes and familiar businesses. And there was Wheatville, established by James Wheat in 1869. The first black newspaper west of the Mississippi was published there after the Civil War. It was called The Gold Dollar and was printed in this building on San Gabriel Street, still there, and surrounded by high-rise student condos now on what has become the University of Texas West Campus. But Austin City Hall in 1928 developed a plan that would force black Americans out of their homes in Wheatville and Clarksville and others scattered around the city. To ensure that people would move, the city warned it would not provide paved roads or sewer lines there. They were to merge into a single neighborhood on the east side of town. Blacks were forced to settle in what city planners called the Negro District. Still, East 11th Street would become the focus of a thriving business community. From the 1940s on, East Austin developed into a center for black-owned businesses, cultural life, and education, a community bonded together by neighborhood churches. But having a place in the political process was virtually non-existent. Black Austinites were shut out of holding elected offices or developing public policy. Making conditions worse, East Austin was considered an industrial zone. In 1948, the big oil companies built a tank farm that would later cause ground contamination around a number of homes. Then, isolation in the 1950s, when construction began on an interstate highway that would run right through East Avenue, what was once an open and accessible boulevard that linked East and West Austin. For many, I-35 created a concrete barrier between the prosperity of downtown and the neighborhood on the other side of town. But there were positive changes too. By the 1950s, there was growing awareness on the part of politicians and the courts that black Americans deserved the same opportunities as whites. With the passage of civil rights legislation and the Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s, black participation in political life took on new urgency. The first black American elected to public office in Austin occurred in 1968 when Wilhelmina Delco won a spot on the city's school board. In 1974, she was elected to represent Austin in the Texas legislature until she retired in 1995. In 1971, Austin elected its first black city council member, Burl Hancock. Voter registration projects became a centerpiece of East Austin life in the 1980s. In the 1990s, families in East Austin won a victory in the courts when the oil companies agreed to dismantle the storage tanks near their homes. But even as early as the 1970s, Austin's black population began leaving East Austin. Historian Lisa Bird has written that even before gentrification that forced many longtime families to move away, black families started moving to suburbs and smaller communities surrounding Austin. For black Americans in Austin, past and present, a long history of struggles and triumphs, with so many new chapters of that history yet to be written.
You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin. You're watching a KVUE News special presentation, Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin.
Finally, a look at 4th and Chacon Streets in East Austin, where this mural is meant to spark conversation about racial equality and injustice.
Painted by local artist Chris Rogers, this mural honors the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, and so many others who've sparked conversations about race in America. Tomorrow, in part 2 of Racial Equality, Building a Better Austin, we'll get into the barriers that stand between Black Austinites and equal access to housing, education, and health care.
We hope you'll join us for that, and we'll see you back here for our regular nightly newscast tonight at 10 o'clock. Have a good night.
I was sick of